Welcome to the second part of our course, Linguistic Literacy. I am Dr. Hanan Halabi from the International Arabic Academy. So today we're going to continue talking about origin of writing, spreading of writing and literacy, and we're going to discuss alphabetic literacy. So starting with origin of writing, so although many nations have claimed that they have invented writing from scratch, only one culture in the Eastern Hemisphere, which is the Mesopotamia, can show in its archaeological records everything that is related to stones, everything that is related to what is left over from that culture. They can record the long series of steps needed to develop this significant invention. It is easy to invent a writing system once someone points out that language can be represented in a permanent form by making actually visible squiggles, each standing for a word or sound. So they had signs, they had symbols, they had stuff that resembled and they showed meaning of words and sounds. But the notion that one can write at all is far more difficult to conceive the first time. Truly one of the world's great ideas. Evidence shows that such an abstraction did not really come easily. To trace its origin in the Near East, we must go back another 5,000 years to 8,000 years to early Neolithic sites in Syria and Iraq. So the Neolithic, or what we call the New Stone Age, differs from what we call the Paleolithic, or what we call the Old Stone Age, in that people now had domestic plants and animals. Things were changed. We had permanent open-air settlements, and we had stone tools ground to a fine edge instead of merely shaped ones. So at a number of Neolithic Near Eastern sites, along with the evidence for early experiments in architecture and weaving, we find actually experiments of clay. So we had like hundreds of tiny balls, cones, discs, and other geometric shapes. Now, at first sight, archaeologists thought that they were pieces of games for children. But now we know that they were used for keeping accounts of livestock, grain, and other possessions, such shape denoting a different commodity, and each animal or unit of goods tallied by a separate piece of clay. Thus, for example, 5 discs with crosses might correspond to 5 sheep, and 3 bowls measures of grain. So the developmental history of this accounting system, which soon spread across the Near East and into Southeast Europe, together with linguistics reconstructions indicating the lack of abstract number words. For example, 6, 7, 8 in any language prior to 3000 before Christ. So it indicates that Stone Age people did not really have an abstract notion of number yet. So that's why they represented numbers through stuff. Lacking number words, they counted simply by matching the animals or jars in question to an equal number of concrete tokens. So such systems continue to be used in few societies. With a simple Neolithic economy, this was sufficient for keeping track of things. Because at that time, economy was not that complicated. Apparently, it was for security against swindlers. The Mesopotamians added the habit of sealing the little clay tokens of a transaction into a clay ball onto which each token had been impressed once. So this enabled everyone to see what count was. But no one could snitch or add tokens. But when, in 4th millennium Mesopotamia, people began gathering in huge cities and needed to redistribute goods for labor in complex ways, they were actually forced to devise a more powerful and more flexible system. So the later history of writing systems shows that each new idea for restructuring writing to make it more efficient, such as moving from word writing to syllabic writing or from syllabic to alphabetic, came from a new group learning the old way of doing things and saying, in effect, there has got to be a better way. Just as each new generation of children structures slightly the language data learned from its elders. So systems of writing in notation have been restructured by those with a fresh view. The same presumably happened here. So about 3,100 years before Christ, in the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, we suddenly see a new take on the meaning of the impressions on the clay envelopes holding tokens. Before, the impression of a small cone meant a small measure of grain, and that of a big cone meant a large measure of grain, which happened to equal 60 of the little measures, just as a gallon happens to equal 16 cups in our system. But now the small cone was reinterpreted as meaning 1 and the big cone as 60. And another measure in between, similar to our quart, was reinterpreted as 10, since it was equal in volume to 10 of the smallest unit. With these impressed shapes reinterpreted as designating the number intended, however, the scribe now had to specify separately the object being counted. At that moment, the system developed into two types of signs, one kind for abstract numbers, the other for names of objects. So the latter corresponded to the vocabulary words of language. Thus, if we want to speak of 4 rings, we don't say ring, 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 or write oh, 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 which is how the Neolithic scribes did it. We use only 2 words, one for the number 4 and another for the object rings. To write this as 4, O would then correspond unit for unit to the words we really speak. So the only problem with this system was that words for abstract numbers did not really exist, because we see such words hastily coupled into being at just this time. We know that they must have been forced into existence by the reinterpretation of the impressed tokens. Now humans had 2 new ideas to expand upon: the notion of abstract numbers. So here we're talking about numbers independent of any particular thing being counted, the notion that the impressed patterns could correspond to the successive words in a spoken phrase or sentence, which is the 4 rings. So drawing little pictures to denote words like ring or tree, pictograms was fine. But what do you do with the grammatical words and other unpicturables like the and or? So the easiest way was to use sound alikes, homonyms or near homonyms. So as in the modern game of charades, thus, if one did this in English, or could be denoted by a picture of an or, and so on, this game called rebus writing was easier to play in Sumerian than in English because most Sumerian words were only 1 syllable long. To tell each word with that sound was meant, scribes began adding extra signs to give clues to the semantic realm. Thus, the or pictogram might have a schematic tree beside it when it meant or, warning the reader to put the word surrounding that way that denoted something with an eliminating or and or. In this way, the script gradually became adequate for representing anything in the language, although it was centuries before grammatical words were consistently written along with the content or the lexical words. As this writing system became more adequate, it also became more unwieldy. so requiring the student to learn hundreds and hundreds of signs. So as we're talking about the spreading of reading and of writing literacy, so other early scripts were equally large and unwieldy, and their structures give some clues to their origins. So the Egyptians appear to have gotten the idea that one could write with pictograms and rebuses from the Mesopotamians around 3,100 years BC, or before Christ, almost as soon as the Mesopotamians invented true writing and then made up their script themselves, basing them some signs on tradition, proprietary marks, and drawing pictures for others. So far, we lack evidence showing the Egyptians walking up step by step to the abstract notion of writing. And we know they borrowed a number of other cultural ideas from Mesopotamia at exactly this period. So this hypothesis of borrowing is the best one we have to date. So the Egyptian pushed right, unlike that in Mesopotamia, seems to have been chiefly religious rather than economic, especially the desire to perceive personal names for an entire afterlife. The very earliest Egyptian inscriptions that have come down to us and are names of kings and pharaohs. So Egyptian writing maintained its predominantly religious character to the very end, even though faster cursive forms of script were eventually devised for writing mundane, secular documents. But the Egyptian script never became simpler, retaining its many hundreds of signs until it fell out of use in Roman times. So the Chinese script, which began to blossom during the first great dynasty of China, the Shang, 1500 to 1100 BC, appears so much later than cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphics, in a period when Chinese already contained loanwords from Iranian and possibly other Indo-European languages from the West, that probably the script was jump-started like Egyptian by diffusion of at least the idea that one could write. So the signs themselves seem to have been created indigenously, but the writing system closely resembles the Near Eastern scripts in being composed of several hundred pictograms, rebuses, and semantic determinatives. On the other hand, archaic Chinese, like Sumerian, continued mostly words of one syllable, so the Chinese were in a convenient position to reinvent for themselves the notion of rebuses. So when a script contains hundreds of signs and considerable ambiguity, an individual must devote enormous time and energy to become literate. In early societies, this had two major consequences. Scribes or writers were specialists. They were fully supported by the rest of society with food, and there were very few of them. In other words, literacy was not something that many could attain. And with so many writers, only the most important things got written down. For the Mesopotamians, the important topic initially was economic transactions. For the Egyptians, religious matters pertaining to eternity, and for the Chinese, oracles about future events. So gradually, other matters, both religious and secular, came to be recorded, but the cost of educating scribes was always a bottleneck, while the past investment by each of these cultures in their systems made throwing them out unthinkable. Such was not the case for neighboring cultures. So over and over, neighbors restructured these systems as they bored them. usually recasting them in such a way as to make the writing more efficient. Living with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia were speakers of various Semitic dialects, such as the Akkadians. When Sargon of Akkad took over Mesopotamia soon after 2400 BC, his scribes took the Sumerian pictograms at their phonetic value alone, no meaning whatsoever implied, in order to spell out the native Akkadian syllable by syllable, which is the syllabic sign. Conceptually, this was a big step forward because there are so few sounds in a language compared to the huge number of words. Unfortunately, the scribes only went halfway, retaining many Sumerian pictograms as a shorthand for Akkadian words. Since the Sumerian word required only one sign in general, whereas Akkadian words, which typically contained 2 to 5 syllables, required many more. So although the Semitic scribes had made major conceptual breakthrough, one that the Chinese never made, it remained for others to benefit from the simplification. So the Hittites, as Indo-European group in Anatolia, which is the modern Turkey, attempted to simplify the Sumerian system. When they borrowed cuneiform, they dropped most of the duplicate ways of writing a given syllable, whittling down the syllabary to just over 100 basic signs. But these scribes too found it handy to keep the Sumerian pictograms as shorthand for many of their vocabulary words, which on average were even longer than Akkadian words. If you had to write out absolutely everything by hand, with no word processor, photocopier, or even typewriter, you too would look for faster ways to write, even if the system ended up more complex. So the people of the Aegean, however, when they borrowed the idea that one could write, eliminated everything except the notion of signs for syllables, creating their own sign shapes from scratch. They also simplified the notion of syllable from the 4 sorts used in cuneiforms: V, which is the vowel, CV, consonant vowel, VC, CVC, where V is the vowel, as I said, C is the consonant, to 2VCV, which meant they could manage with a mere 80 or so signs. Well, almost for economic accounts, they also used a roster of single signs, pictograms or ideograms for each different commodity, but these signs were not mixed together with syllabic sign to form a sentence. This sort of system took much less time to learn and made it possible, at least theoretically, for more people to become literate in their spare time. So the people of Minoan, Crete, who used the system for a short time in the mid-second millennium before Christ, left us elegant inscriptions on jewelry and stone, economic accounts on clay, and graffiti on walls and pottery, suggesting widespread literacy. Unfortunately, they wrote most of their texts on perishable materials that have not survived. A similar reinterpretation leading to an even more radical simplification occurred in the Sinai Peninsula around 1900 BC, where Semites from the north encountered Egyptians from the south at local copper and turquoise mines. The Semites apparently saw the Egyptian writing system and learned something of its structure, but concluding there must be a simpler way. The Egyptian script, unlike cuneiform, did not specify the vowel that the syllabic sign was to convey, only the consonant. So when the Semites, like the Minoans, pared away all the duplicate ways of writing syllables, they found themselves with a mere 20-some signs, specifying that many different consonants. This new script, the so-called Semitic, consonantal syllabary was clearly based on Egyptian sign shapes at first, and it had a tremendous advantage. Anyone could learn this tiny number of signs in a few hours. Spelling consisted simply of sounding out the words as one wrote, so spelling did not need to be learned as such. The drawback, of course, was the ambiguity for readers. So the writer knew what spoken vowels were intended, but TH or HD, T, GSS, THM, leaving much potential ambiguity unless writers wrote only for their use. This may have been the dominant use. However, because variants of the simple script quickly spread up the coast all the way to Syria. Along the way, it generated what became the Hebrew, Phoenician, Ugaritic, Aramic, and Arabic scripts and more, all of which are or were consonantal syllabaries and generated a much wider range of uses, implying wider literacy. So we know that all these scripts were related because they all use the same canonical order of signs for teaching the script. An order ancestral to our modern alphabetical order. One clear and early document of this sort is a tablet from a schoolroom in the city of Ugarit, on the coast of Syria, in which the signs have been modeled for the pupil in which standard order. Because Syria was heavily influenced by Mesopotamian culture, the letters are written with wedge-shaped or wedge shapes on clay, but those shapes have nothing to do with the shapes of signs in mainstream cuneiform. Only the cheap clay medium was borrowed. The final step in developing the most efficient possible writing system was to add separate signs for vowels, eliminating the guesswork without adding many more signs. Remarkably, this step was first taken around 1400 BC in Ugarit, 6 centuries before the Greeks produced their alphabet. The structure of Hamito-Semitic languages in such that vowels are not so important for determining the basic semantic contents of a message as they are in virtually all other languages. It is surely no accident, therefore, that it was Semites who made the big step in simplification to the consonantal syllabary. But Ugarit had two main linguistic populations, Western Semites and Hurrians. The Hurrian language belonged to yet another family centered in the Caucasus to the north. The Hurrian merchants, reaching or searching for a better way, reused the sign here and added a sign there to obtain the vowel signs they needed to write their language readably. As they did so, however, the system cracked into two entirely types of signs, signs for single vowels and signs for single consonants, such that the latter were no longer signs for entire syllables of a consonant plus an implied vowel. Each sound in the language now had a sign of its own, and each sign represented a single sound, the definition of a true alphabet. Now, readers could read unambiguously what the writer wrote, and for only the cost of learning a couple of dozen symbols. Unfortunately, this brilliant idea was almost immediately lost in the massive destruction in the Bronze Age, and it remained for the Greek to reinvent the same step around 800 BC as they pondered the ambiguous consonantal syllabary still used by the Phoenician traders. The canonical order of the Semitic script thus passed to the Greeks and is still visible despite the reuse of some unneeded consonantal signs as vowels. The addition of a few letters and the retention of some unnecessary signs, the Greeks passed one version of their alphabet to the Etruscans, who passed it to the Romans, each time with minor modifications. With a few more changes in the medieval times, it came down to us today as the Roman alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet used in Eastern Europe branched off in medieval times directly from the Greek alphabet. Now we come to talk about alphabetic literacy. So the simplicity of the alphabet should have meant that now everyone would learn to read and write. Yet the evidence tells a somewhat different story. Everyone could learn to write, but for centuries, few did. Early Greek inscriptions are few, mostly labels and short dedications. The first person we know who used writing systematically to record everything he wanted to make a note of was the great Athenian statesman Solon, living around 600 BC, who apparently kept personal notes of what he learned abroad and what he thought about political matters. This is a use of writing not seen before, but soon to become commonplace. The fragmentary nature of our evidence may, of course, have hidden some other earlier examples in other scripts. One might suspect the third dynasty Egyptian genius Imhotep of similar practices, but clearly such a use was not common elsewhere. While Solon had something he thought important for his countrymen to remember, he actually put it into verse so they could memorize it easily, a fact indicating that most of the population was not literate. By 500 BC, however, citizens of Athens, that is, those inhabitants who were free and male, were expected to know how to read the public notices and write their own ballots, although anecdotes show that not all could. And throughout the 5th century, the golden age of Athens, literature was still primarily oral, still experienced commonly in the theater as the great dramas of Ethicos, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes attest. Written copies of the plays were, however, increasingly available. Our first reference to a new form of literacy, reading to oneself for one's own adult pleasure, occurs in Aristophanes' The Frogs, written in 405 BC, in which a not very bright Athenian citizen says he was sitting around on shipboard between practice maneuvers, reading one of the tragedies to himself. In fact, at this time, both Aristophanes and Socrates voiced concern over the rise of mass literacy, worrying that the flood of written information could cause people to forget important things of life. So then the flood hit. From then on, rated drama on the stage was replaced in Greek society by great books to be read, the philosophical work of Plato and his successors, which start interestingly as oral dialogues in form, although too deep to be fully appreciated in one hearing. And there were new types of lesser works, such as novels to be purely for fun. A major watershed had been crossed. In the West, most of this progress was lost with the destruction of Roman Empire around 400 BC by illiterate hordes. Literacy retreated to the monasteries, where the storing, copying, and reading of books became sacred tasks. Leadership ceased to be clean and simple, since now the criteria were different. The desire to shorten the task of copying led to complex ligatures and other methods of abbreviation, which they were easily recognized. So books had been also printed in China since at least 886 BC, and probably earlier, using carved wooden blocks. So there had been many ideas, including John Gutenberg's ideas of printing with movable type. So it changed all our common ideas. His first printed books are very difficult to read, but simplicity of letter designs returned quickly as easier access to books fostered greater literacy, and greater literacy, together with the possibility of multiple copies, fostered more new texts to read. But there was a new bottleneck, the high cost of printing media. Vellum and parchment were very expensive, and paper a little explored craft. With the invention of pulp paper late in the 18th century, however, books could be printed so cheaply that even lower class workers could afford them, carrying in their pockets not just novels but printed manuals of the increasingly complex machines. In a sense, it was manuals printed on pulp paper that fueled the Industrial Revolution. So in the 20th century, people were so inundated with printed materials that computers were invented to manage the glut, and those computers are inevitably changing patterns of literacy once again. So thank you for listening. See you in another course.